Clara Whitmore pressed her fingers against her ribs and breathed through her teeth, because crying on a public street was something she had promised herself she would never do again. The stagecoach door swung shut behind her. The dust hit her face like a slap. Julesburg, Colorado. End of the line. End of everything she had known. She looked down at the crumpled letter in her hand, the one that was supposed to save her life, and realized her hands were shaking so badly she could barely read her own name. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow until the very last word. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled away before Clara had fully steadied herself on the ground. That was the thing about running, it never waited for you to catch your breath. The moment you stopped moving, the world kept going, indifferent and loud, and full of strangers who had no particular interest in your survival. Julesburg in July was not the soft green countryside she had pictured during those long swaying days on the road west. It was dust and heat, and the thick smell of horses and dried manure, baking under a sky so white it hurt to look at. The main street stretched in both directions, like something reluctant storefronts with faded paint. A saloon already working through its afternoon crowd. Women in calico dresses, moving quickly between errands, men in wide hats who stopped what they were doing to look at the stagecoach and its passengers with the casual ownership of people who had always belonged somewhere. Clara had not belonged anywhere in 8 months. She clutched the letter against her chest and pressed her free hand to her side, where 3 ribs were still mending from the last time Gideon had decided she needed to understand something. She was 27 years old. She had graduated from Miss Hargrove's Academy in Boston. She had once played Chopin in her father's parlor while guests applauded. She had once believed that being educated and careful and quiet would protect her from the worst of what men could do. She had been spectacularly wrong about that. The letter was addressed from a Wyatt Mercer, Julesburg, Colorado, and had been arranged through a correspondence service that Clara had found in the back pages of a women's periodical in the waiting room of a lawyer's office she could no longer afford. The lawyer had not been able to help her. The periodical had been her last idea. Rancher. Honest work. Separate arrangements respected. Looking for a capable woman who wants a quiet life. She had written back the same afternoon, sitting in a rented room she was 3 days from being removed from, and had not mentioned Gideon once. She looked down the street now, searching for a man she had never seen. There was a wagon parked near the far edge of the street, a bay horse and a roan tied to the post beside it. The man standing next to the wagon was not what she had imagined. She wasn't entirely sure what she had imagined. Older, perhaps. Wider around the middle. Something easier to discount. Wyatt Mercer was tall in the way that came from actual work, rather than posturing broad through the shoulders, his skin sun-browned past the collar line where his shirt opened at the throat. He wore a plain hat, dusty boots, and an expression that suggested he was accustomed to waiting, but not accustomed to being comfortable about it. He was scanning the passengers coming off the coach with the focused patience of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. His eyes found her. Clara took 1 step toward him. Her vision tilted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no warning. One moment she was standing upright with her carpetbag in her hand, and the next moment the street came up sideways, and she understood dimly and without much interest that she was going to fall. She had not eaten since the previous evening. The rib pain had kept her from sleeping. The heat was something she had no reference point for, having spent her entire life in the regulated temperatures of Boston drawing rooms and covered carriages. She went down beside the lead horse of the wagon team, her knee hitting the packed dirt first, then her palm, the carpetbag tumbling sideways. From somewhere above her, a man's voice said, "Well, looks like Mercer bought himself damaged goods." There was laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Clara pressed her palm flat against the dirt and tried to push herself upright. Her arm shook. Her ribs screamed at her. She thought very clearly, "Do not cry. Do not cry on a public street. You promised." Boots appeared in her line of vision. Not the boots she expected, not the amused shuffle of someone coming to gawk. These boots moved with intention, planted themselves between her and the direction the laughter was coming from, and stopped. She heard a voice, low and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who had learned long ago that volume was less effective than certainty. "She is not goods," Wyatt Mercer said. "She is my future wife. and the next man who speaks about her like that will find himself explaining it to me outside the limits of polite company." The laughter stopped. Clara looked up. I was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was not pity, which she could not have survived, and it was not the measuring assessment of a man calculating his investment. It was something simpler and harder to categorize, like someone who had seen a thing that needed doing and had simply decided to do it. He crouched down to her level, which put him out of the dominant posture that most men would have maintained, and held out his hand. "Can you stand, Miss Whitmore?" "I can stand," she said, which was only partially true. "All right," he said. He did not argue with her. He simply kept his hand where it was until she took it, and then he helped her to her feet in a way that bore most of her weight without making her feel carried. He picked up her carpetbag himself. "My wagon's right here," he said. "There's water in the back. We'll get you sorted before anything else." She followed him the 3 steps to the wagon because she had no other viable direction. Martha Bell's house sat on the edge of the respectable part of Julesburg, which meant it had curtains and a swept porch and a kitchen that smelled of real coffee, not the burnt chicory substitute that Clara had been surviving on for weeks. Martha herself opened the door before they reached it, which suggested she had been watching the street, which in turn suggested that Wyatt had told her something about the situation in advance. Martha Bell was 56 years old, wide through the hips, gray at the temples, and possessed of the particular expression common to women who had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by its cruelty while still being fully capable of anger about it. She took one look at Clara. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "Wyatt put her bag in the blue room. Then go outside and see to your horse." "Martha, I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked you to put the bag in the blue room and go see to your horse." Wyatt put the bag in the blue room and went to see to his horse. Martha sat Clara down at the kitchen table and put a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits in front of her without asking whether she wanted them. Then she sat down across the table and folded her hands and looked at Clara with the direct, unblinking attention of someone who intended to see past whatever surface was being presented. "I'm not going to ask you anything you don't want to tell me," Martha said. "But I want you to know that I've seen what I've seen, and I'm not a fool, and whatever happened to you before you got on that stagecoach is not going to follow you into this house. Not today." Clara's hands were around the coffee cup. She could feel the warmth moving through her palms up her wrists into the cold place that had been sitting in the center of her chest for 8 months. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I have 3 ribs that aren't healed properly. The journey was difficult." "I expect it was," Martha said, and did not press. Clara ate 2 biscuits and drank the coffee, and felt something in her shoulders release by a fraction that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Wyatt," she said carefully. "What kind of man is he?" Martha considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Quiet," she said finally. "Stubborn in the good way, not the bad way. He was married before, 8 years ago. She didn't survive the second winter. He blamed himself for a long time, because that's the kind of man he is, the kind that picks up responsibility whether it belongs to him or not." She paused. "He's not looking for romance, Miss Whitmore. I want to be honest with you. He's looking for a partnership. Someone to help him keep the ranch going and have a life that's worth something. That's what he offered." "That's what I need," Clara said. "That's exactly what I need." Martha nodded slowly. Then I think you might suit each other tolerably well." The wedding was 3 days later in the parlor of the Julesburg church, with Martha and the minister's wife as witnesses, and nobody else invited. Clara wore her second-best dress because her best dress had been torn during the last night in Boston, and she had not yet decided whether she would ever mend it or simply leave it destroyed as a kind of record. Wyatt stood beside her in a clean shirt and his good hat, and said his vows in the same level, certain voice he seemed to use for everything, and Clara said hers in a voice she had to concentrate to keep steady. When it was done, he offered his arm to walk her out of the church. She took it. Outside in the summer heat, he paused on the church steps and turned to look at her. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I mean what I offered in the letters. Your room is your room. The key is yours to keep. I won't come in without asking. and if you ask me to stay on my side of the house, I'll stay there until you say otherwise." He held her gaze without flinching. "No door in this house will ever lock you in. That's a promise I intend to keep, Mrs. Mercer." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the doors in her cousin's house in Boston, the ones that locked from the outside, the ones that had no handles on the inside, the one at the top of the servants' stairs that Gideon had bolted the night he decided she was becoming inconvenient. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more profoundly than she could explain. The ranch was 7 miles outside of Julesburg, which meant 7 miles of open land, summer dry grass and sky that went from horizon to horizon without a building interrupting it. Clara had grown up in a city. She had never understood before how much of her tension was simply the accumulated weight of being watched and surrounded at all times. Out here, the space was enormous, and the silence was real. She sat on the wagon seat beside Wyatt on the drive back, and did not feel the need to fill the quiet with conversation, and he did not fill it either. And that was the first moment she thought that maybe this was going to be survivable. The ranch house was modest. The kind that had been built for function rather than impression, with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze and windows that opened on both sides for cross-ventilation. The kitchen was large and practical. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that was cold in the summer heat, and shelves of ledgers and repair manuals, and unexpectedly, 3 novels. Clara noticed the novels. "You read," she said. "When the work allows it," Wyatt said, and she heard a trace of self-consciousness in his voice that she found unexpectedly humanizing. "I expect that's not much of a library compared to Boston." "I expect it's 3 more books than most ranches have," she said. He looked at her. She had not meant it to be funny exactly, but something in her delivery had apparently struck him as wry, because the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Your room's through there," he said, recovering himself. The room had a window that looked over the east pasture, a quilt on the bed in a pattern of blue and cream, a small table with a wash basin, and as promised a key on the inside of the door. Clara locked the door that night with the key on the inside, and stood in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the horses in the near corral, the dry summer wind moving through the grass, and the complete, extraordinary absence of footsteps outside her door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs to stop the shaking, and then for the first time in 8 months, she cried. Not from fear, not from pain, from something she couldn't name for a long time, until she finally landed on the right word. Relief. The first week was careful and quiet, like 2 people who have agreed to share a narrow bridge and are determined to be courteous about the crossing. Wyatt was up before dawn every morning. He made coffee and left a portion for her on the back of the stove, which she came to understand was a gesture of consideration rather than expectation. He did not require her to be up at any particular hour. He did not require anything of her that she hadn't agreed to. She started getting up earlier because she wanted to, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. That distinction felt enormous. He showed her the kitchen organization, without condescension, handed her the ranch ledgers, with the explanation that he was better with cattle than with numbers, and would be grateful if she could make sense of the accounts, and taught her to light the wood stove on the one cool morning that happened that week, without once suggesting that not knowing how was a failing. She burned the first 2 batches of biscuits. "The stove runs hot on the right side," he said without looking up from the fence post he was repairing outside the kitchen window. "You might have mentioned that before." "I should have," he said. "That's on me." She made the 3rd batch on the left side of the stove, and they were edible, and she felt a small, fierce satisfaction that she hadn't expected. On the 4th morning, when she brought coffee out to the corral, where he was working with one of the horses, he accepted it with a nod, and then said, "That horse over there, the gray one, she's the easiest to ride, if you wanted to learn." "I've never been on a horse." "I figured. The gray's patient. She won't punish you for not knowing." Clara looked at the gray horse. The gray horse looked back at her with what she could only describe as professional calm. "All right," she said. He taught her in the evenings after the worst of the heat had passed. He corrected her grip without touching her hands unless she asked. He explained what the horse was communicating through its body language in the same practical way he explained everything. And when she finally managed to hold a steady trot for the length of the south pasture and back, she could hear him say "good" quietly from the fence post where he was watching, and it registered somewhere entirely different than approval usually landed. The town, however, was not quiet. Julesburg had opinions about Wyatt Mercer's mail-order bride, and it did not keep those opinions to itself. The first time Clara went to Hooper's general store alone, Mrs. Hooper served her with the specific variety of politeness that contains no warmth whatsoever, the kind that follows every transaction, with a comment designed to land just below the threshold of direct insult. "Of course, we don't usually extend credit to new accounts," Mrs. Hooper said when Clara presented Wyatt's established account number. "Arrangements change." "My husband's account," Clara said, "which has been maintained at this store for 6 years according to the ledger." "Yes, well," Mrs. Hooper looked at her over the top of her spectacles. "I'm sure Mr. Mercer's situation is quite different now." Clara paid in cash, which she could not afford to keep doing, and walked out of the store without giving Mrs. Hooper the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Outside, she stood in the heat and breathed through her nose until her hands stopped clenching. At the livery stable, a ranch hand named Cutter, who worked the property adjacent to Wyatt's, leaned against the post and said loudly to the man beside him, "Reckon Mercer's going to be regretting that Eastern purchase before the summer's out. Trouble always looks pretty getting off the stage." Clara kept walking. That evening she told Wyatt about the store. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go in tomorrow and speak to Hooper," he said. "I don't want you to fight my battles," she said more sharply than she'd intended. He looked at her carefully. "I wasn't planning to fight anything. I was planning to remind him that my account is my account and my wife's word is as good as mine on it. That's not your battle. That's just a fact that needs restating." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. I went the next morning. She did not know what was said, but when she went to Hooper's the following week, the credit was extended without comment. She filed that away, the distinction between someone who fights on your behalf to prove their power and someone who simply corrects an incorrect situation because it is incorrect. Done. 3 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived from Boston. Wyatt brought it to her at the kitchen table where she was working on the accounts and set it down without comment, and then went back outside because he had somehow already learned that she needed space around difficult things. She stared at the handwriting on the envelope for a long time. She knew that handwriting. She had spent 8 months trying to get far enough away that she would never see it again. Gideon Randolph Price. Return to sender address, 14 Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts. Her cousin, her guardian legally, since her father had died without understanding what kind of man Gideon was beneath the polished surface. Her tormentor, the man who had taken everything her father had built and called it his by right of being male and present and persuasive to the lawyers who handled the estate. She opened the letter. It was brief. "Clara, your disappearance has caused considerable embarrassment to this family. Your father's state remains unresolved. You are legally under my care as his appointed executor until such matters are settled, regardless of whatever arrangements you have made in your absence. I intend to travel west and see this corrected. You should prepare yourself to return to Boston. G.P." She set the letter on the table. She pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. He was coming. He had found her. Of course he had found her. Gideon Price was charming to every person he had ever needed something from, including lawyers, judges, and the men who ran the correspondence services that lonely women in desperate situations wrote to when they had run out of every other option. Of course he had found the trail. She was still sitting at the table very still when Wyatt came in for the noon meal. He saw her face. He looked at the letter. He did not ask. He waited. "My cousin is coming," she said. "He has a legal claim, at least he believes he does. He'll say I'm unstable. He'll say I stole from the estate. He's very persuasive, Wyatt. To strangers, to officials, to anyone who doesn't know what he is when the door closes." Her voice was steady, which cost her something. "He will come here, and he will be charming and controlled, and he will make everyone in this town believe that I am something to be pitied or managed or returned, and they will believe him because he has practiced at it, and I—" She stopped. Wyatt sat down across from her. "And you what?" he said. "And I have spent so long being afraid of him that I don't know if I can stand up in public and say the truth out loud." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been telling me the truth every day," he said, "in how you work and how you treat the animals and how you manage those accounts better than I ever did. You've been telling me the truth in about 100 ways since you got here." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't think the problem is that you can't say it. I think the problem is that nobody's ever stood still long enough to hear you say it without Gideon Price there to talk over you." Clara looked at him. Something in her chest shifted, not dramatically, not like a revelation in a novel. More like a door that had been stuck for a very long time, finally moving a single inch on its hinges. "He's going to come here," she said. "Let him come," Wyatt said. "This is our town now too, and he'll find that's a different thing than Boston." She looked at the letter on the table. She thought about the bruised photograph frame, the torn legal document she'd sewn into the lining of her travel coat, which she hadn't yet told Wyatt about. The things she had carried west with her, not because they were valuable, but because they were true. "I have evidence," she said quietly, "that he's been falsifying debt notices, that the inheritance was mine. I've been carrying it for months because I didn't know who to give it to." Wyatt was very still. "Then we'll find the right people to give it to," he said, "before he gets here." Outside, the summer wind moved through the dry grass of the east pasture, and the gray horse stood in the near corral with her patient professional calm, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled in the white-hot Colorado sky, riding the heat without effort, going nowhere in particular, and entirely at ease with that. Clara folded Gideon's letter in half. She held it for a moment. Then she set it aside and pulled the ranch ledger back in front of her and picked up her pen. There was work to do. And for the first time in 8 months, she had somewhere to stand while she did it. The ledger was wrong. Not wrong in the way of honest mistakes, a misplaced column, a figure transposed. Wrong in the way that required intention. Clara had been working through Wyatt's accounts for 2 weeks, and she had found it 3 days after Gideon's letter arrived, buried in the pages from 8 months prior, when she had still been in Boston, and Wyatt had still been a stranger's name on a correspondence card. A debt notice, handwritten, for a cattle purchase. Wyatt had apparently made from a supplier in Denver, a supplier whose name Clara recognized because it was one of the shell names Gideon used when he was moving money between accounts he didn't want traced. She sat with that knowledge for an entire morning before she said anything. Then she brought the ledger to Wyatt at the fence line where he was working, set it open on the top rail and pointed. "Did you buy 60 head of cattle from a company called Meridian Stockworks in October of last year?" He looked at the page. His jaw tightened. "No," he said. "I bought 40 head from a man named Castillo out of Pueblo. Paid him directly. Cash transaction." Then someone added 20 head and changed the supplier name after the fact. She kept her voice level. "And the handwriting on this notice is not yours." He looked at her. "You know whose it is," he said. It was not a question. "I've seen that handwriting on legal documents for 2 years, she said. "Gideon has been tracking me long enough to find the correspondence service. He's also been building a paper trail that makes it look like you're in business with him. If he arrives here claiming I defrauded his estate and fled west, and your own ledger shows a financial connection to his suppliers." She stopped. "He's not just coming to take me back, Wyatt. He's coming to make sure that when he does, you look like either a fool or a co-conspirator." The silence that followed had weight. Wyatt took the ledger off the fence rail and looked at the page for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating something significant. "When did this get added?" he said. "Sometime in the last 4 months. Before the page there's a gap in the binding. Someone removed a page and reinserted this one. It's subtle, but if you know what to look for." "How do you know what to look for?" She met his eyes. "Because I spent 2 years watching him do it to my father's accounts before my father died." Another silence. Different from the first. "All right," Wyatt said finally. "Then we need someone official to look at this before Gideon gets here. Someone whose word the town will take." "The sheriff. Judge Callan's in town through the end of the month. He's a fair man, knows me. More importantly, he doesn't know Gideon Price from Adam, which means Gideon can't charm him before we get to him. He closed the ledger. I'll ride in this afternoon. I'm coming with you. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not move. All right, he said. Give me 20 minutes to get the horses. Judge Callan was 71 years old, built like something that had started rough and been further roughened by weather and argument, and he listened to everything Clara laid out on his desk. The ledger, the false debt notice, the letter in her travel coat lining that had her father's signature, and described the inheritance in terms that admitted no ambiguity, with the focused silence of a man who had heard a great many stories and was calibrating this one carefully. When she finished, he looked at her over his spectacles. You've been carrying this documentation since Boston. Since the night I left, she said. I didn't know who to trust with it. I didn't know if there was anyone to trust. And this Gideon Price, you believe he's already in motion. He sent that letter 3 weeks ago. From Boston, the mail is 3 to 4 weeks. He may already be on a train. Callan looked at Wyatt. You vouch for the legitimacy of this woman's account. I vouch for her character, Wyatt said. And I vouch for the fact that page in my ledger was not there when I last reviewed it in March. Callan was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the falsified debt notice and looked at it for a long time. I'm going to keep these documents in my safe, he said. Both the notice and the original letter. If this Price arrives and makes claims against either of you, I'll want to hear it in a proper setting with both sides present. He looked at Clara. You understand that I can't take preemptive action against a man who hasn't yet done anything in my jurisdiction. I understand, Clara said. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to be prepared to hear the truth when it's necessary to say it. Callan studied her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with sentiment, but with the particular recalibration of someone who had expected less and received more. I expect that's a reasonable request, he said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon heat, and the conversation between them was mostly silence. But it was the kind of silence that had changed quality. Less careful. More like two people who had done something difficult together and were still processing what it meant. About 2 miles from the ranch, Clara said, Thank you for not telling him what to think of me before I had the chance to speak. Wyatt kept his eyes on the road. It wasn't mine to tell. She turned that over for a while. Most men would have, she said. Most men would have had a different kind of wife, he said without inflection. I've got the kind who carries legal documents in her coat lining and can identify financial fraud in a ledger she's been working for 2 weeks. I figure that speaks for itself. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something more useful, an acknowledgement of what she actually was, rather than a softened version of it. Clara found to her considerable surprise that she preferred it. The town did not become warmer, if anything. The arrival of Gideon's letter. The fact of it, not the content which Clara had told only Martha and Wyatt, seemed to travel through Julesburg on its own current the way bad news always does in small places. Nobody could have known what the letter said. But people saw the change in Clara's posture during her trips to town, the way Wyatt rode in with her more consistently, the afternoon visit to Judge Callan's office, and drew conclusions with the practiced efficiency of a community that had too much time and too little entertainment. Mrs. Hooper mentioned to a customer that she'd heard Clara Mercer had some kind of legal trouble following her out from the east. Cutter, the ranch hand from the adjacent property, told anyone at the saloon who would listen that he'd always said Mercer was a fool to mail-order a wife without references. A woman named Dorothy Phelps, who had taken a dislike to Clara at the church social on the grounds that Clara had failed to admire her lemon cake with sufficient enthusiasm, began referring to Clara as that Boston woman, in a tone that turned the phrase into something mildly pejorative. Clara heard about most of this from Martha, who heard about it because she went to town every day and paid attention, and who reported it to Clara over coffee, with the brisk, unflinching efficiency of a military advisor delivering intelligence. Let them talk, Martha said on a morning when the heat was already brutal before 9 o'clock. Talking costs them something too, even if they don't know it yet. Does it? Clara said. Always does. The people who gossip hardest are always the ones who have the most to feel ashamed of later. Martha refilled her cup. The ones who matter, Callan Reverend Hughes May Sutton at the post office. They haven't said a word against you. They're watching. That's different. Watching to see which way it falls, Clara said. Watching to see who you are when it gets hard, Martha corrected. Which is the only time it matters. Clara turned her cup in her hands. And what do they see? Martha looked at her steadily. They see a woman who went to Judge Callan's office with evidence instead of tears. They see a woman who works her husband's accounts and rides his land, and hasn't once asked this town for sympathy she hasn't earned. She paused. They see more than you think they do. Clara was quiet for a moment. I dreamed about Boston last night, she said without particularly intending to say it. About the house, about the room he locked. What happened in the dream? Nothing. That's the worst part. In the dream I was just sitting there waiting, and I couldn't remember what I was waiting for anymore. She set down the cup. I've been free for 2 months, and I still dream about waiting for the door to open. Martha was quiet. Then she reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. A brief, firm contact. Nothing prolonged or theatrical. Just the weight of it. That's not a character flaw, Martha said. That's what he did to you. Those aren't your dreams, Clara. Those are his leftovers. Clara looked at her. His leftovers, she repeated. And you get to clean them out, Martha said. On your own schedule, nobody else's. He rode in on a Thursday. Clara knew before Wyatt said anything. She was in the kitchen working through the week's supply list when she heard hoofbeats on the main road that were wrong too. Deliberate, too measured. The horse of someone performing an arrival rather than completing a journey. She went to the window, even at distance, even after everything. Her body recognized him before her mind finished the identification. The tightening across her shoulder blades. The cold that moved through her stomach. The old trained reflex to become smaller, quieter, less visible. Gideon Price rode down the main road of Julesburg at the pace of a man who expected to be watched. He was 35, handsome, in the architectural way of men who understand that appearance is a resource, impeccably dressed for a man who had been traveling for weeks. He had already stopped at the hotel. That was clear from the freshness of his collar. He was smiling. How was always smiling in public. That was the first thing people noticed. That was the thing they remembered later when they were trying to understand how they'd been wrong about him. Wyatt came in from the back without being called. He looked at her face. He didn't need to look out the window. He's here, he said. He's already been to town, Clara said. Her voice was steady. The rest of her was not. He'll introduce himself. He's very good at introductions. He'll tell someone he's worried about his cousin. He'll use the word worried, exactly that word, because it makes him sound caring rather than controlling. He'll say she had some kind of breakdown after her father died. He'll seem sad about it. Wyatt was watching her. And then, he said, and then the town will have already decided before he's had dinner. Or, Wyatt said, we go to town first. She looked at him. What? It's Thursday. Martha's going to the dry goods store this afternoon. The Reverend holds his open office hour at the church. May Sutton will be at the post office. He held her gaze. We could go do our weekly errands. We could let the town see us going about our ordinary business. We could let them see that we're not hiding. Clara thought about it. He'll see us, she said. I expect he will, Wyatt said. That's not entirely a disadvantage. They were at Sutton's post office when it happened. Clara was collecting the week's mail, chatting briefly with May about the heat and the late summer grass. Normal conversation grounded the conversation of a woman who lived here and knew the rhythms of this place when the door opened behind her and the air in the room changed. She felt it before she turned. The particular drop in temperature that happened when Gideon entered a room, which she understood now was not supernatural, but entirely psychological, the trained response of a body that had learned to brace. She turned anyway, on her own time, slowly. Gideon Price stood in the doorway of the post office with his hat in his hand and his smile perfectly calibrated to suggest relief mixed with sorrow. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has spent weeks in agony over a beloved family member. Clara, he said softly, thank God. Gideon, she said. Just his name. Nothing attached to it. May Sutton was watching with the alert stillness of someone who would remember every detail of this for the rest of her life. I've been so worried, Gideon said, and stepped into the room. When you left without a word, we didn't know what had happened to you. Whether you were safe, whether you were... He paused with exactly the right amount of delicacy. Well, in the right frame of mind. I'm in a perfectly clear frame of mind, Clara said. I'm collecting my mail. He looked at Wyatt, who was standing a step to Clara's left and behind which put him in a position of support rather than dominance. Gideon assessed this in under a second. You must be Mr. Mercer, he said, extending his hand with the smooth confidence of someone who has never had a handshake refused. I want you to know I don't hold you responsible for any of this. Clara can be very persuasive when she sets her mind to something. I imagine she told you quite a story. Wyatt shook his hand and said nothing. Gideon's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalibrated. He had expected either hostility, which he knew how to use, or deference, which he preferred. The silence was harder to work with. I'd like to sit down with you both, Gideon said. Somewhere private. There are legal matters involving my uncle's estate that really do need to be resolved, and I think once we've had a chance to talk, we'll find this is all much simpler than it seems. I expect you'll want to speak to Judge Callan as well, Clara said. He's been expecting your arrival. The smallest pause. Has he? Gideon said. He has, Clara said. We wanted to make sure the legal matters were handled properly, through official channels. Gideon looked at her, and for just a moment, just a fragment of a second, the smile slipped. Not far. Not enough for May to catch it, probably. But Clara had been watching that face for years, and she caught it, and the catching of it filled her with something that was not quite triumph, but was in its vicinity. He had expected to arrive and find her isolated and reactive. He had not expected her to have moved first. Of course, he said pleasantly. Official channels, absolutely. He replaced his hat and smiled at May. Thank you for your time, ma'am. He nodded to Wyatt. Mr. Mercer, we'll talk soon. He looked at Clara last, and this time the expression was different, still performing, still wearing the mask, but underneath it, something else. Something that recognized it had walked into a different situation than anticipated. Clara, he said softly. It's good to see you're well. The door closed behind him. May Sutton exhaled. Well, she said in a voice that carried both assessment and conclusion. I see what you mean. Clara turned to look at her. May was watching the door where Gideon had exited with the expression of someone who has just identified something that had been bothering them. Too smooth, May said simply. Men who are genuinely worried about someone don't come into a room like that. The next 4 days moved at the speed of something inevitable. Gideon worked the town, the way he worked every room methodically, attentively, with the specific skill of a man who understood that trust was a currency, and he was very good at counterfeiting it. He had dinner with the Hoopers on Friday. He attended the Sunday service and shook the Reverend's hand and made a donation that Clara heard about from Martha by noon. He introduced himself to the sheriff with a letter of reference from a Boston magistrate that he had presumably arranged before he left. By Monday, the whispers in town had shifted texture. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. They say he's a respectable man, Martha reported at their Tuesday coffee. They say he seems genuinely concerned. He always seems that way, Clara said. That's the mechanism. I know it. May knows it. Callan isn't moved by it. Martha set down her cup. But Mrs. Hooper is. And Cutter's been drinking with someone from Gideon's hotel 2 nights running. She paused. He's building, and he'll want to move before Callan's session at the end of the month. Then he'll make his play this week, Clara said. That's what I think too. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had been quiet for a great deal of the past week, not from fear, she told herself, though she was honest enough to admit that fear was present, but from the particular concentration of a person who is getting ready to do something they have never done before and cannot afford to do badly. Martha, she said, that letter, the one my father wrote before he died, the one that's with Callan. Does Gideon know I have it? He can't be certain what you have. He'll assume the worst. He always does. She pressed her palms flat on the table. He's going to move fast and he's going to be public about it. He'll want witnesses. He'll want an audience. That's how he operates in front of people where I've historically become quiet and frightened, and where my silence reads as guilt. Martha looked at her carefully. And this time, Clara met her eyes. This time, I'm not going to be quiet, she said. Something moved across Martha's face, not surprise. Something more like watching a door open that had been closed for a long time. Good, Martha said simply. Gideon made his move on Wednesday afternoon during the summer cattle auction at the Julesburg stockyards, which was the single most public gathering Julesburg produced between June and September. Half the county was there. The sheriff, the judge, the merchants, the ranchers. Every person whose opinion shaped what this town believed about itself. Clara and Wyatt had come because it was a ranch matter. Wyatt was considering a bull purchase, and because not coming would have looked like avoidance. She felt him arrive before she saw him. The same drop, the same brace across the shoulder blades. Gideon came through the crowd with two men flanking him. Strangers not from Julesburg, which told Clara he had hired them somewhere along the route west for exactly this purpose. He had the sheriff at his elbow within 30 seconds, which meant he had been cultivating that relationship specifically. He stopped in the center of the stockyard clearing where the crowd was thickest, and his voice carried with the trained projection of a man who had given speeches. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'm glad you're here. I think it's time we addressed this matter openly, since private conversation doesn't seem to be something your wife is willing to attempt." The crowd went still. Clara felt Wyatt shift his weight beside her, not toward Gideon, toward her. Just enough that his shoulder was a degree closer. She felt that small adjustment like a physical statement. Wyatt Mercer. Gideon continued his voice, carrying the practiced sadness of a man performing reluctant duty. "I want to say publicly that I believe you were deceived. My cousin Clara left Boston under difficult circumstances. She was not in a stable condition. She took money from my uncle's estate money that was being held in trust, and she used it to fund a disappearance. Now I understand you married her in good faith, and I have no wish to make your situation harder than it needs to be. I simply need her to come home so we can resolve matters properly." The crowd listened. The crowd always listened to a man who spoke with that kind of confidence. The sheriff, to his credit, looked uncomfortable rather than convinced. Judge Callan, who was standing to the left of the main crowd, was watching with an expression that revealed nothing. Clara took a breath, and then she stepped forward. Not toward Gideon, not toward the crowd. Just forward out of the slightly sheltered position she'd been standing in into the open space where she could be clearly seen. "May I speak?" she said. Her voice did not shake. It surprised her how much that cost, and how steady it came out regardless. The crowd shifted attention. Clara had been quiet for 2 months in this town. She had been present and civil and industrious and unremarkable, and suddenly she was standing in the open center of the largest public gathering of the year, and asking to speak, and the very novelty of it made people listen. "I took nothing from my father's estate," she said. "My father's estate, under the terms of his will, was to pass to me on my 25th birthday. Gideon Price was named executor, meaning he was responsible for managing the transition, not for owning the assets." She kept her voice level and her eyes on the crowd, rather than on Gideon, because she had learned years ago that looking at him directly gave him too much room to respond. "He has spent 2 years claiming that role gives him authority over me personally. It does not. Judge Callan currently holds a copy of my father's will and a letter written in my father's own hand, both of which confirm what I'm telling you." Colin nodded once from his position at the edge of the crowd. Not an endorsement exactly, a confirmation of the fact. The crowd stirred. Gideon's smile was still in place, but it had gone hard at the edges. "Clara, sweetheart, I understand that you believe." "Don't call me sweetheart," Clara said. It was quiet. It was entirely without theater, and it landed in the summer air like something dropped from a height. Gideon stopped. "I am Mrs. Clara Mercer," she said. "I am a legal resident of Julesburg, Colorado. I am a married woman who has committed no crime and taken nothing that did not belong to me. and I have documentation to support every word I'm saying, which is currently in the custody of a federal judge. She finally looked at Gideon directly. You came a very long way to tell people a story about me. I'm telling you in front of witnesses that the story is not true. The stockyard was quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for what came next. The weighted quiet of people recalibrating. Gideon looked at her, and the face he showed her then for just a fraction, for just the span of a breath, was not the concerned cousin or the sorrowful guardian. It was the face she had seen behind locked doors in Boston, stripped of performance, and it was ugly in a way that had nothing to do with his features. You think a marriage license makes you untouchable? He said, his voice lower now, the public projection gone. It was aimed at her, not the crowd. I think the truth makes me untouchable, she said. The marriage license just means I'm not alone while I tell it. Beside her, Wyatt said nothing. He didn't need to. His stillness was its own statement, the statement of a man who had no intention of leaving and no anxiety about what came next. Gideon looked at both of them. He looked at Callan. He looked at the sheriff who had taken a half step away from him sometime in the last 3 minutes. He put his smile back on. It fit less well than it had an hour ago. This isn't finished, he said quietly to Clara specifically. Whatever you think you have, it won't be enough. It will be, Clara said. Come to the judge's chambers tomorrow morning and find out. She turned back to the cattle pens. Her hands were shaking. Nobody could see that, because she had her arms at her sides and her face forward, but she felt the trembling moving through her palms and up her wrists, and she breathed through it with the concentrated effort of a person doing something their body is screaming against, while their mind insists on proceeding. Wyatt fell into step beside her. After a moment, he said quietly, so only she could hear, "That was the bravest thing I've seen done in this county in a long time." She kept walking. I was shaking the entire time. I know, he said. I could see it. That's what made it brave. She almost stopped walking. She didn't. But it was close. Behind them in the stockyard, she could hear the crowd beginning to talk. Not the whisper of gossip, but the louder sound of people processing something they hadn't expected. Reassessing a conclusion they'd drawn too quickly. Doing the slow and sometimes grudging work of changing their minds. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was the sound of ground shifting, and Clara Mercer, who had spent 8 months running and 2 months holding, still recognized it for what it was. The first moment in a very long time when the ground had shifted in her direction. That night, Clara did not sleep. She lay on her side in the blue room with her eyes open and listened to the ranch settle around her. The horses in the corral, the dry wind moving through the grass, the occasional creak of the house adjusting to the cooler night air. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a place that was hers, in a way she was still learning to believe. Her mind would not stop running. She kept returning to Gideon's face in that last moment at the stockyard, the mask coming off the ugliness, underneath the quiet threat he'd delivered, like a man who still believed he held the winning hand. Whatever you think you have, it won't be enough. She had answered him cleanly in front of witnesses with her voice steady and her evidence secured. And still those words turned in her chest like something with edges. Because she knew him. She knew that when Gideon Price said it wasn't finished, he was not making a general statement. He was describing a plan. She was still turning that over when she heard a soft knock at her door. Not demanding, not urgent. The particular knock of someone who expected to be told to go away and was willing to accept that. Clara. Wyatt's voice low. You don't have to answer. I just wanted you to know I'm up. If you needed to talk. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she got up and opened the door. He was standing in the hallway in his work clothes, which told her he hadn't attempted sleep either. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, which told her he'd been thinking about knocking for a while before he actually did it. She took one of the cups and leaned against the doorframe. He's going to do something tonight or tomorrow morning, she said. Before the judge's chambers. He needs to move before we do. Wyatt nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. What can he do? Legally not much with Callan holding your documents. He looked at his coffee. But Gideon Price doesn't strike me as a man who stays inside the legal lines when the legal lines aren't working for him. She looked at him. No, he doesn't. I sent word to Callan tonight, Wyatt said. Asked him to have the sheriff keep an eye on the hotel. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. He'll have thought of that. He'll have thought 3 steps further than that. Probably. Wyatt met her eyes. Then we think 4 steps. She almost smiled. He's going to try to discredit the evidence, she said. Not destroy it, he can't get to Callan's safe. But if he can cast doubt on it before the formal session, if he can get enough people in this town talking about my mental state or my motivations. She stopped. He has the Boston magistrate's letter. He'll use that. He'll say that the document my father wrote was produced under duress, that I manipulated a dying man. Would anyone believe that? Anyone who wanted to believe it? She paused. Mrs. Hooper, Cutter, the people he's been cultivating all week. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Martha told me something before she left this evening. What? She said she has a letter too, from your father, separate from the one in Callan's safe. He watched her face. She didn't tell me the details. She said she'd explain in the morning. But she said, and this is her exact words, she said, tell Clara that Edward Whitmore was a more careful man than Gideon ever understood. Clara went absolutely still. My father knew Martha, she said, apparently. Wyatt's voice was careful, attentive to whatever was moving across her face. Did you know that? She shook her head slowly. And then, because the pieces were beginning to assemble into something she hadn't known existed, she sat down on the edge of the hallway bench and pressed her hand over her mouth. Her father had been a careful man. She had always known that. He had built his business through 40 years of meticulous documentation of letters and records and copies held in multiple locations, of never trusting any single point of failure. She had inherited that from him, the instinct to carry documentation sewn into coat linings, to keep copies, to assume that any single record could be lost or altered. Her father had known Gideon. He had known what Gideon was capable of, and he had been more careful than Gideon ever understood. Whatever Martha has, Clara said quietly, it's what he put in place for exactly this situation. That's what I figured, Wyatt said. She looked up at him. He knew he was dying. He knew Gideon would move on the estate. He knew I might not be safe. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and she steadied it. He left me a path out, and I didn't even know it was there. Wyatt sat down on the opposite end of the bench. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Your father sounds like a man worth grieving. And that, for some reason, was the thing that made her throat close entirely, because it was accurate and specific and offered without agenda, and she had not had very many people in the past 8 months say accurate, specific things without agenda. She pressed her lips together and nodded once sharply. Get some sleep, Wyatt said. He stood up, took her empty cup back. Whatever Gideon does tonight, we'll meet it in the morning. Gideon moved at dawn. Not toward the ranch, not toward the judge's chambers. He moved toward Martha Bell. Clara learned this from May Sutton, who sent a boy out to the ranch at 7 in the morning with a handwritten note that said, Price came to Martha's house at first light with the sheriff. Something about the property. Martha sent for Reverend Hughes. Get here. Wyatt had the horses saddled in 8 minutes. They came into town at a pace that collected attention, which Clara would have preferred to avoid but could not prioritize over speed. By the time they reached Martha's house, there was already a small cluster of people on the street outside. Not a crowd exactly, but the instinctive gathering of a small town that senses something happening. The sheriff was on the porch. His expression when he saw Clara and Wyatt dismount was the expression of a man who is in the middle of something he has realized too late is more complicated than presented. Gideon was in the parlor. Howe was standing near the window, with his hat in his hands, and his concerned cousin expression perfectly restored, as if the stockyard confrontation had never happened. Reverend Hughes was in the corner, upright and watchful. Martha was seated at her own table in the center of the room, and her face was the face of someone who has decided that today is the day. There she is, Gideon said when Clara came through the door. His voice was gentle, as if he were welcoming her home. Clara, I'm glad you're here. I've been explaining to the sheriff. What are you doing in Martha's house? Clara said. I'm trying to help, he said. Mrs. Bell has been holding certain correspondence that belongs to my uncle's estate. Letters that were removed from the Whitmore household during Clara's departure. I've asked the sheriff to recover them as estate property, the sheriff, to his considerable credit, said. Now I haven't agreed to recover anything. I've agreed to hear the matter out. Those letters are mine, Clara said. Written to me by my father. Written from a man who was not of entirely sound mind in his final months, Gideon said with careful practiced sadness. Clara, I know this is painful, but Dr. Hargrove's attestation in Boston, which the magistrate's letter references, documents your father's cognitive decline. Letters written under those conditions may not reflect his actual wishes and almost certainly don't constitute valid legal. Let me see the magistrate's letter, Clara said. Gideon blinked. I beg your pardon. The letter you've been showing people, from the Boston magistrate. Let me see it. A pause. Brief but real. It's at the hotel, he said. Then we'll wait while you retrieve it. Clara, I don't think... Sheriff, Clara said, turning. I'd like to formally request that before any property changes hands in this matter, we see the documentation Mr. Price has been using to establish his authority, including the magistrate's letter, the executor appointment, and Dr. Hargrove's attestation he just referenced. The sheriff looked at Gideon. That seems reasonable, he said. Can you produce those documents, Mr. Price? Gideon's smile was still there, but he had stopped responding to it from the inside. Clara could see that now the way she could always see it when he'd been pushed past the position he'd prepared for. The expression was still running, but the man behind it was calculating. Of course, he said. Give me an hour. We'll be at Judge Callan's chambers, Clara said. We'll see you there. She turned to Martha. Martha was already standing, and in Martha's hand, which Clara saw for the first time, which Gideon had clearly seen before they arrived, and which had been. She understood the actual reason for this morning visit was an envelope. Old. The seal broken long ago and carefully preserved. In handwriting that Clara recognized across the room. Her father's handwriting. Firm and precise and completely heartbreakingly familiar. I think, Martha said, looking directly at Gideon, that it's time we let the judge read this. Judge Callan's chambers held 6 people comfortably. With Wyatt. Clara, Martha the sheriff, Reverend Hughes, and Gideon Price. It held 7, with the particular intimacy of people who have no choice but to be honest with each other. Callan read Martha's letter first alone, while the rest of them waited. It took 11 minutes. Clara counted. She sat beside Wyatt at the long table, and at some point during the 5th minute, without discussion, without decision. She put her hand flat on the table, and his hand covered it. Not tightly, just present, just there. Gideon was across the table, and to the left, and she did not look at him, and she was aware of him with every part of her peripheral nervous system regardless. Callan set the letter down. He removed his spectacles and set those down too. Mr. Price, he said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it, because your answer will determine a considerable amount of what happens in the next hour. He looked at Gideon steadily. Did you present the Boston Magistrate's office with Dr. Hargrove's attestation of Edward Whitmore's cognitive decline before or after your uncle's will was formally probated? The room was very quiet. Before, Gideon said, which was the proper procedure. Dr. Hargrove, Callan said, is referenced in this letter as the physician whom Edward Whitmore explicitly documented as being in your personal employ as of January of last year. Your uncle describes him in these pages as... He glanced at the letter. A man whose professional integrity I would not trust with my horse's welfare, let alone my legal affairs. He looked up. Would you like to explain how a physician your uncle explicitly distrusted became the primary medical witness to his incompetence? Silence. Not the brief calculating silence of a man forming a response. The longer silence of a man whose architecture is beginning to fail. That letter was written by a man in the final stages of... A man who wrote 12 pages in the clearest legal prose I've read in 15 years on the bench, Callan said without raising his voice. A man who anticipated in specific detail every claim you have made in this room and in this town over the past week. A man who appears to have understood exactly what you were planning and documented his counter-arguments before you had the chance to execute them. He set the letter precisely flat on his desk. Your uncle, Mr. Price, was not a man in cognitive decline. Your uncle was a man who was watching you very carefully. Gideon's jaw moved. Martha Bell in the corner made no sound. But something in her posture shifted with the satisfaction of a woman who has been carrying a truth for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. The magistrate's letter, Clara said quietly to the sheriff. I'd still like to see it. The sheriff looked at Gideon. Mr. Price, he said. The letter. Gideon stopped. I'll need to get it from the hotel. Deputy Marsh will accompany you, the sheriff said. And Mr. Price, I'll ask you to avoid any stops along the way. Gideon came back with the letter. He had to. The deputy had been thorough, and whatever Gideon had hoped to accomplish in the 40 minutes he was gone, he had not managed it. He came back looking like a man who has tried 3 doors and found all of them locked, and who is now standing in a hallway with no remaining options and the full understanding of what that means. The magistrate's letter, when Clara read it, contained something she had not expected. The attestation of her father's competency issue was real meaning. Gideon had filed it, meaning someone at the magistrate's office had stamped it as received. But the date on the filing was 4 weeks before her father died. At which point, as Callan pointed out after comparing dates with the will documentation, her father had been in full possession of his faculties, actively conducting business, and apparently writing 12 careful pages about what his nephew was planning. The filing is fraudulent on its face, Callan said. Your uncle was legally competent and documented to be so. At the time this attestation was filed, the magistrate's office received a document claiming otherwise from a physician with a documented personal relationship to the filing party with no corroborating medical opinion. He folded his hands. This is not a legal gray area, Mr. Price. This is a forgery used to obtain a fraudulent probate ruling. Gideon was very still. The performance was gone. Clara had seen it go before that specific moment when the face he showed the world finally stopped holding its position. She had seen it in the locked rooms in Boston, seen it the second before the decisions that left her with broken ribs and a long list of things she could not say in public. She had spent 8 months afraid of that face, watching it appear in a federal judge's chambers across the table from a man who had all her father's documentation, and a clear legal record of everything Gideon had done was a different experience than she had anticipated. She had expected to feel afraid. She did not feel afraid. She felt very precisely, and with a clarity that surprised her, that she wanted him to understand. I'm not doing this to destroy you, she said. Gideon looked at her. The first honest look he had given her in years. I'm doing this because my father built something his whole life, and you took it, she said. And because whatever I went through in that house, she held his gaze without flinching. No woman should have to go through, not ever. And if anyone comes to Julesburg in the future trying to claim another woman, trying to use legal paper to make someone's life small and locked, I want there to be a record. I want there to be something on file that says it was tried here and it did not work. The room was silent. Gideon's face did something she had never seen it do before. It cracked. Not dramatically. Not into tears or remorse, because she did not think he was capable of remorse in the way normal people understood it. But the architecture of the performance he had maintained for 35 years shifted, and underneath it was something she had not expected. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he understood for the first time that she was entirely real. You'll ruin me, he said. You ruined yourself, she said. I'm just providing the documentation. The arrest was quiet. That surprised people later when they talked about it. They expected something dramatic, shouting resistance, a scene worthy of the build-up. What they got was Gideon Price sitting very still at Judge Callan's table, while the sheriff explained the charges, and then standing up and allowing Deputy Marsh to escort him out of chambers with the particular numb compliance of a man who has spent his entire life believing he was untouchable and has just encountered the limit of that belief. He did not look at Clara as he left. She thought he might. She had braced for it for the last performance, the final attempt at an expression that would follow her home. But he simply walked out and the door closed, and that was all. The room breathed. Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and covered it with her hand. The Reverend said quietly, "I'll go speak to the congregation." The sheriff collected the documents with the careful efficiency of a man who understood he was handling something that would be referenced in court for some time. Callan looked at Clara. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "your father's estate will need to go through proper probate proceedings, which will take some months. You'll need a lawyer in Boston. I can recommend one. The fraudulent ruling will be overturned, but these things move slowly." He paused. "I want you to be prepared for a process rather than an immediate resolution." "I can manage a process," Clara said. "I've had practice." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, when the summer heat was at its full and brutal peak, and the light came off the dry grass in waves that made the distance shimmer and shift. Clara sat on the wagon seat beside Wyatt and felt the sun on her face with a directness that she could not bring herself to resent. She had spent so long in locked rooms and covered carriages, in the careful management of where she was allowed to be and when. The heat was direct and honest and asked nothing of her but presence. "How are you?" Wyatt said. She thought about it seriously, which was the only way she knew how to answer him. "Strange," she said. "I expected to feel more. I expected—" She stopped. "When I imagined this moment over the past 8 months, it felt enormous, like it would resolve something fundamental inside me." She looked at the road ahead. "It doesn't. It feels necessary. It feels right. But I still—" She pressed her hand against her sternum. "There's still something in here that hasn't caught up with the outside events." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense to me," he said. "Does it? I had a horse once, good horse, steady animal, that had been badly treated before I got her. Even after 2 years of being fed and cared for, she'd still flinch at sudden movements. She'd been taught something deep, and the teaching didn't go away, just because the situation did." He kept his eyes on the road. "The body remembers what the mind is willing to move past. That's not a failure. That's just how the learning gets undone. Slowly." Clara looked at him. I was not looking at her. He was looking at the road ahead, with the steady, unhurried attention he gave to everything, and she thought that Wyatt Mercer might be the most useful person she had ever encountered, because he never said more than was needed, and never said less than was true. "You're comparing me to a horse," she said. "I'm comparing you to a very good horse who deserved better handling," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "That is marginally more complimentary," she said. "I thought so." She almost laughed. It came out small and brief, but it was real, and it startled her. The physical fact of it, the way it moved through her chest differently than the stone that had been sitting there. Wyatt glanced at her sideways. "There it is," he said quietly. She looked at him. "What?" "Something I haven't seen yet," he said. "Figured it was in there." She looked back at the road. The ranch came into view ahead, the plain functional roofline, the wide porch, the east pasture where the gray horse was moving in slow, unhurried circles. Home, she thought, and then caught herself thinking it, and sat with the word for a moment, testing its weight. It held. That evening, Wyatt went to the corral to see to the horses before dark, and Clara stood on the porch and watched the summer sky go through its colors, the white heat fading to amber, then to a deep saturated orange that made the dry grass look like something precious. Martha arrived at the porch steps without announcement, because that was Martha's way. She sat down in the other chair without being invited, because that was also Martha's way. For a while, neither of them said anything. "How was kind to me," Clara said finally. "My father. People forget that about him because he was serious and formal in public. But he was kind, in private." She paused. "I used to bring him his evening tea, and he'd read to me from the newspapers and explain things. He thought it was important for me to understand how the world worked." She looked at her hands. "He must have known at the end that he hadn't done enough to protect me, that he'd trusted the wrong person with my safety. He did the most he could," Martha said. He wrote everything down. He trusted me to hold it. He trusted that you would survive long enough to need it. Clara looked at her. How did you know him? Our fathers were in business together. Many years ago. Martha's voice had a different quality than usual, softer, more careful. He wrote to me when you were a girl, just periodically, keeping in touch. She paused. When he wrote to tell me what Gideon was becoming, I told him to send me whatever he needed kept safe. I never expected it to matter for this long. Did you know I'd come here? I hoped you might go somewhere west. He'd mentioned the correspondence services to me in the last letter before. She stopped. He said he'd made sure you knew about them, that if things became impossible, you'd have a direction to go. Clara pressed both hands against her face. Her father had built her an exit. He had built her an exit and trusted strangers to hold the pieces of it, and had hoped from a dying man's hope that she would know how to use it. She had not known, but she had run in the right direction. She had picked a name out of a periodical and written a letter and gotten on a stagecoach and collapsed in front of the right wagon on the right street in the right town. Sometimes the path held, even when you couldn't see it. Martha put her hand on Clara's arm briefly. Just the weight of it. Then withdrew. He would be proud of you today, Martha said. What you said in that room, the way you said it. He would have recognized himself in it. Clara lowered her hands. The sky was deepening toward full dark now, and the first stars were coming through, and from the corral, she could hear Wyatt moving with the horses, the low, steady sounds of someone doing familiar work with care. I have a lot of rebuilding to do, Clara said. The estate, the legal process, She stopped. Everything. You do. Martha agreed without softening it. And you'll do it. You're already doing it. Clara looked at the stars. She thought about her father's careful hands on the newspaper pages. She thought about the locked room in Boston. She thought about a stagecoach door swinging shut and dust hitting her face, and a man stepping between her and a laughing crowd with the words, "She is not goods," landing on the street like something permanent. She thought about a key on the inside of a door. She thought about learning to ride in the summer evenings with someone who corrected her grip without touching her hands unless she asked. She thought about being seen, not managed, not handled, not performed for, but genuinely, practically, quietly seen. Martha, she said. Thank you. For holding the letter. For all of it. Martha was quiet for a moment. Your father asked me to make sure you were all right, she said. I'm not done with that job yet. From the corral. Wyatt's voice came across the evening air, not calling to her, just speaking quietly to the horses, the low reassurance of a man at ease in his own place. The gray horse answered with a soft sound. Clara sat on the porch of her ranch under a sky full of stars and felt the difference between surviving and something else. Something she didn't yet have the full right word for, but that lived in the same neighborhood as belonging and was moving steadily, stubbornly in that direction. The ground had shifted, and this time she intended to stand on it. The days after Gideon's arrest moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just differently. The way air moves differently after a storm has cleared, when the pressure finally releases and the world remembers how to breathe normally. Clara noticed it first in her own body, the gradual loosening of something she had held so tightly for so long that she had stopped recognizing it as tension. She would be standing at the kitchen stove, or working through the account ledgers, or walking the east pasture with the gray horse, and she would catch herself simply present, not braced, not listening for footsteps that didn't belong. It was disorienting, that absence of fear. She hadn't expected that. She had expected relief, and relief had come, but underneath the relief was a kind of disorientation she couldn't fully name, like a person who has been leaning against a wall for so long that when the wall is removed, they don't immediately stand straight. They wobble. They have to learn the balance again. She was wobbling. Wyatt saw it. He didn't say anything about it directly, which was the thing she appreciated most about him, his instinct to observe without immediately trying to fix. He simply adjusted his own behavior in the small practical ways she had come to recognize as his version of care. He started leaving the coffee on the front of the stove instead of the back, so she could reach it without bending, because her ribs were still finishing their healing, and he had somehow noticed she favored her left side in the mornings. He stopped bringing in the ranch hands for the noon meal on the days she seemed to need the house quiet. He asked her opinion on the bull purchase he'd been considering at the auction, and when she raised a question about the animal's age relative to the asking price. He sat with her concern for a full day before deciding she was right and passing on the purchase. Small things. Consistent things. The accumulation of a person who was paying attention without making the attention feel like surveillance. One morning, 10 days after the arrest, she came out to the porch at dawn and found him already there with 2 cups, which had become without any formal agreement a thing they did. He handed her one. They watched the sun come up over the east pasture in the particular silence that had stopped being careful and started being comfortable. "I got a letter from the Boston lawyer," she said. "Callan's recommendation. Good news. Promising news. The fraudulent probate ruling has been flagged for review. It will take time," he said, 8 months minimum, possibly more. "But he says the documentation is strong." She turned the cup in her hands. "He also says there's a question about the property. My father's house. Gideon had taken out loans against it using the fraudulent executor authority." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Can those be unwound?" "Partially, maybe. The lawyer says it depends on which lenders can be proven to have known the authority was fraudulent." She exhaled. "I may not get the house back. I may get the liquid assets and lose the property." "How do you feel about that?" She considered the question seriously. "I feel like the house was where a great deal of bad things happened to me, and also where a great deal of good things happened before that." She paused. "I think I feel like it's a building, and what mattered about it was my father, and my father is gone, and a building without the person is just walls." She looked at the east pasture. "I have walls here." Wyatt looked at her. She had not entirely meant to say that, but she did not take it back. "Yes," he said. "You do." They watched the light change on the grass, and the gray horse move toward the fence line in her slow, purposeful way. And somewhere in the near distance, a hawk found a current and held it without effort. And Clara felt something settle in her chest, like a stone, finding its right place at the bottom of clear water. She was not fixed. She knew that. Knowing a thing was resolved was not the same as the body believing it, and her body was still catching up with the series of events her mind had processed. She still flinched at unexpected sounds. She still woke sometimes in the gray before dawn, with the certain adrenaline-sharp conviction that something was wrong and had to lie still and list the sounds of the ranch until her heartbeat understood where she was. But she was getting better at the listing. The town shifted slowly, the way towns do not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the gradual accumulation of small adjustments. May Sutton had apparently told the full story of the post office encounter to at least 4 people, with the specific emphasis on Gideon's too smooth entrance and Clara's quiet, precise response. By the following week, 3 women had stopped by the ranch on various pretexts. A borrowed pan, a question about the East Road that were transparently excuses to look at Clara directly and decide something. Clara offered them coffee each time and answered their real questions without pretending they weren't asking them, and they left looking like people who had resolved something they'd been uncertain about. Mrs. Hooper did not come, but her husband did one afternoon and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and talked about the weather and the late summer grass for approximately 3 minutes before finally saying, "My wife feels she wants me to tell you that she may have been hasty in forming certain opinions. She's not easy about apologizing herself, but she wanted it said." "Tell her I appreciate it," Clara said, "and that I'd be glad to see her at the reading circle when it gets going." Hooper blinked. "Reading circle?" "I'm starting one," Clara said. "Martha's helping. We'll meet Thursday evenings. Women from town mostly, but anyone's welcome." She paused. "Tell her the first week I'm making those lemon biscuits from the recipe my father's cook used in Boston. I've been practicing." Hooper looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who has delivered a difficult message and received in return something more generous than he expected. "I'll tell her," he said. He left looking lighter than he'd arrived. The real test came on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the arrest, when Dorothy Phelps appeared at the ranch gate. Clara saw her coming from the kitchen window and felt the old reflex fire, the brace, the preparation for hostility, and then deliberately put it aside. She went to the door and opened it before Dorothy reached the porch steps. Dorothy Phelps was a woman of 50, solid and direct, who had spent the better part of 2 months making pointed comments about that Boston woman to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps now with her hands clasped in front of her, and an expression that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, but something more complicated, the expression of a person in the middle of doing something hard. "I owe you an apology," Dorothy said. "No preamble. I formed an opinion without information, and I repeated it in public, and that was wrong of me." Clara looked at her. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." Dorothy blinked. "You don't want to?" "Hear the apology first. You already gave it. That took something." Clara held the door open. "Come in." Dorothy came in. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and Dorothy, who it turned out had been widowed 3 years prior under circumstances that had left her with limited resources and a great deal of unprocessed anxiety about stability and respectability, talked for 20 minutes about things she had never said to anyone in Julesburg. Clara listened. She did not offer advice or comparison. She simply listened with the attention of a person who understood exactly what it cost to say things out loud for the first time. When Dorothy left, she had agreed to come to the reading circle. Clara stood on the porch and watched her go, and felt something she didn't immediately identify as important, but which was. She had not been afraid of Dorothy Phelps. She had not been managing the encounter, calculating the response, performing the safe version of herself. She had simply been present and honest, and it had been enough. That was new. She was still standing on the porch when Wyatt rode in from the south pasture and saw her face and slowed his horse. "Good news or strange news?" he said. "Strange news that might be good news," she said. Dorothy Phelps came to apologize. He absorbed this. "What did you do?" "Made her coffee." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression. She was beginning to recognize the specific look of a man who keeps being surprised by the same person in ways he finds entirely satisfying. "All right," he said, and rode on toward the corral. The twist came on a Tuesday. A letter arrived from the Boston lawyer, and this time Clara read it at the kitchen table with Wyatt sitting across from her because she had stopped needing to be alone with difficult information. Or rather, she had started understanding that not being alone with it was a choice she was allowed to make. She read it once. Then she set it down. "What?" Wyatt said. "Gideon made a deal," she said, "with the federal prosecutor. He's agreed to plead to the fraud charges and return the liquid assets of my father's estate in exchange for a reduced sentence." She paused. "The lawyer says it's a reasonable outcome. The fraud case is solid. The reduced sentence avoids a lengthy trial, and the asset recovery is faster through the deal than through full proceedings." "But," Wyatt said, because there was clearly a but as part of the deal, he's agreed to sign over executor authority to a court-appointed administrator. Which means he formally, legally in writing, surrenders any claim to authority over me or my father's estate." She looked at the letter. "It's done. The lawyer says barring any extraordinary development, it's done." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's what you wanted," Wyatt said carefully. "Yes," she said. "And then because it was true. And I feel nothing like what I expected to feel." "What do you feel?" She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Tired," she said. "I feel very tired. Like I've been running for so long that stopping feels wrong, and my legs don't know what to do with stillness, and I want to sleep for approximately 100 years. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, came around the table, and sat down in the chair beside her, rather than across from her. He did not touch her. He simply moved into the closer distance and stayed there. "Sleep as long as you want," he said. "The ranch will be here." She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 3 months now at the kitchen table from the wagon seat across the corral fence in the quiet mornings on the porch, and she was only now beginning to understand what she was actually seeing. Not the inventory she'd made when she first arrived, assessing threat level and trustworthiness and the likelihood of violence. Not the careful observation of a woman who has learned to predict men by their smallest movements. Something else. Something that had been building so gradually she hadn't tracked the construction. She was seeing him, Wyatt Mercer, who had stood between her and a laughing crowd on the worst day of her life, and called her his future wife, in a voice that contained no hesitation. Who had given her a key for the inside of a door, and meant it completely. Who corrected her grip without touching her hands unless she asked who left coffee on the front of the stove because her ribs hurt in the mornings. Who said you don't have to answer before knocking on her door at midnight with coffee he'd been thinking about offering for an hour. Who compared her to a good horse, and meant it as the highest possible compliment. Who was sitting beside her right now, not touching her, not speaking, not filling the space with reassurance. She hadn't asked for, just present just there. A warm and steady fact in a room that had stopped feeling temporary. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah. I want to tell you something and I need you to not respond immediately." He looked at her. "All right. When I wrote to the correspondence service," she said, "I was not looking for a husband. I was looking for a place to disappear. I was looking for something that sounded enough like safety that I could justify getting on a stagecoach and leaving everything I'd ever known behind." She kept her voice steady, which cost less than it used to. "I told myself it was practical, that it was a transaction, a mutual arrangement between two people who needed something the other could provide. I told myself that was enough, that I didn't need it to be anything more than that." Wyatt was very still. "And," he said after a moment, "and I was wrong," she said. "Not about what I needed when I left. I needed exactly what I said: safety distance, a door with a key on the inside. You gave me all of that." She paused. "But somewhere between the biscuits and the ledgers and the gray horse, and the way you said she is not goods to a street full of strangers who were laughing at me." She stopped. "It became something more than what I agreed to, for me. And I don't know if that's—" She stopped again. "Clara," Wyatt said, "I told you not to respond immediately." "I know. I'm not responding to what you just said." He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, or rather had seen in pieces, in fragments, in moments she'd catalogued and not known what to do with. "I'm responding to the fact that you're about to talk yourself out of finishing what you were saying, and I don't want you to do that." She looked at him. "Finish it," he said. She took a breath. "I think I love you," she said. "I think I've been building toward it since you sat down to my level in the street, so I didn't have to feel small, and I don't entirely know what to do with that because I've never—" Her voice went unsteady, just slightly. "I've never had it be something safe before. The loving. It's always cost me something I couldn't afford." The kitchen was very quiet. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The first week you were here, you burned the biscuits twice, and told me the third batch was a work in progress. And I thought there is a woman who doesn't collapse when things go wrong, who finds the next thing to try." He paused. "I've been watching you for 3 months, Clara. Watching you learn the horse and the stove and the ledgers and the town. Watching you carry that coat with the documents sewn in the lining without telling me because you were still learning whether I was safe to tell." He held her gaze steadily. "I've been in love with you since the afternoon you told Judge Callan I'm not asking you to take preemptive action. I'm asking you to be prepared to hear the truth. And I didn't say anything because you were already carrying so much, and I didn't want to be one more thing you had to manage." She stared at him. "You've been in love with me since the judge's chambers," she said. "Possibly before that," he said. "But that was when I knew for certain." She laughed. It was different from the small brief thing on the wagon seat, fuller, warmer, the kind of laugh that comes from something unexpected, landing exactly right. It moved through her chest and cleared something out and left the space cleaner. "You could have said something," she said. "So could you," he said. "We're both apparently terrible at this." "We are," she said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his on the table. Not the careful sideways contact from the judge's chambers, something more deliberate than that. Something that knew what it was doing. His hand turned under hers and held it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. That night after supper, they sat on the porch in the chairs that had developed through 3 months of use, the particular comfortable arrangement of furniture that has found its right position. The summer air had finally developed a hint of something cooler at the edges. Not the cool of autumn yet, but the suggestion of it, the first acknowledgement from the season that it would eventually relent. Clara was reading. Wyatt was working through a repair manual for the windmill pump, which had been making a sound he didn't trust. The porch lamp threw its small circle of warm light over them both. It was entirely ordinary. That was the thing she kept landing on, with a sense of wonder that she recognized was probably disproportionate to the occasion, and didn't care. It was ordinary. Two people on a porch in the evening reading. The horses quiet in the corral. The stars coming up in the east. The sounds of a place that was lived in and tended and real. She had not had ordinary in so long that she had forgotten it was something to want. "Wyatt," she said. I'm going to formalize the reading circle, make it official, find a space in town, establish regular hours, see about getting a small lending library going. Martha knows a book dealer in Denver." She paused. "I want it to be more than social. I want it to be useful. A place women can come when they need information. Resources. A person to talk to who won't repeat it." She looked at him. "Like what I needed and didn't have." He set down the repair manual. "What would you need for that?" he said. "Some of the estate money when it comes through. A space I've been thinking about the back room at May's post office. She mentioned she'd been looking for a use for it. Sometime." She paused. "Your support. Publicly. Because this town still looks to you to take the measure of things, and if you stand beside it, they'll take it seriously." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "I'll stand beside it," he said. "Same as I stand beside everything you do." She looked at him. There were things she could have said, acknowledgments of what that meant, expressions of what it cost and what it gave. She could have talked for an hour about what it was to have someone who stood beside rather than in front of, who supported without requiring credit, who showed up with quiet consistency in a world that had taught her to expect the opposite. Instead, she said, "Thank you." He nodded once. They went back to their books. The night moved around them, warm and vast and full of ordinary sounds. And Clara sat in her chair on her porch in her life and felt for the first time in longer than she could calculate that she was not waiting for anything. She was already somewhere. She had already arrived. 3 weeks later, a letter came from a woman in Denver. Clara almost didn't read it. The return address was unfamiliar, the handwriting unknown. But May had passed it along with a note that said, "Found your name through Judge Callan's office. Read it, MS." She read it. The woman's name was Helen Marsh. She was 24 years old. She had left a situation in St. Louis that she described in 3 brief, careful sentences that said everything without saying anything that could be used against her. She had heard through a circuit of whispers that traveled through courthouse offices and correspondence services and the informal networks of women who passed information. The way they passed recipes, quietly, reliably, from one safe hand to the next. That there was a woman in Julesburg, Colorado, who had stood up in a public square and told the truth about what had been done to her, and that the truth had held. She wanted to know if there was somewhere safe to come. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was at the fence line, which was where he usually was in the late afternoon, and he looked up when he heard her coming, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his tools and wait. She handed him the letter. He read it. "She's asking if it's safe to come here," Clara said. "To Julesburg." He looked at her. "What do you want to tell her?" he said. Clara had been thinking about it since she read the letter. She had been thinking about everything it meant, the responsibility of it, the weight, the fact that she was still building her own stability and being asked to be someone else's landmark at the same time. She had been thinking about what Martha would say, and what her father would have recognized in it, and what the woman on the other end of this letter needed to hear. "I want to tell her yes," Clara said. "I want to tell her to come." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Then tell her. It'll change things. More than the reading circle. More than—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "Tell her to come," he said. "We'll figure out the rest the way we've figured out everything else." She looked at him, and then she folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and turned back toward the house, and began composing in her mind the words she would write to Helen Marsh in Denver. The words that would say, "Yes, there is somewhere safe. Yes, there is someone here who will hear you. Yes, the truth holds when you give it the right ground to stand on." The ground here held. Clara Mercer knew that now. She had tested it with everything she had, and it had not given way. Helen Marsh arrived on a Wednesday. Clara was at the post office collecting the week's correspondence when the stagecoach pulled in, and she recognized the specific quality of the woman who stepped down from it. The careful way she moved the hand that pressed briefly against her side, the eyes that swept the street in a single practiced arc before allowing herself to fully stand upright. The assessment of someone who had learned that any space could become dangerous and had stopped apologizing for needing to know the exits. Clara had stood exactly that way 4 months ago on this same street. She handed her mail to May without looking at it and walked across to the stagecoach. Helen Marsh was younger than her letter had suggested, early 20s, dark-haired, wearing a dress that had been mended twice at the cuff. She had a carpet bag and the particular stillness of someone who has been bracing for a long time and doesn't know yet that the bracing can stop. "Helen," Clara said. The woman turned. Her eyes were already calculating friend or threat, safe or dangerous. The question that lived permanently behind the eyes of someone who had been given too many reasons to ask it. Clara said, "I'm Clara Mercer. You wrote to me." Something in Helen's shoulders dropped by a single degree. Not full release, that would take time, but recognition, the beginning of belief. "I didn't know if I should come," Helen said. Her voice was careful, held close. "I know," Clara said. "Come anyway. There's coffee at my friend Martha's house, and we have things to talk about." She picked up one side of Helen's carpet bag without asking. Helen looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had simply appeared and picked up half the weight without making an occasion of it, and something in her face shifted. Not much, but real. She followed Clara down the street. Martha, who had been told to expect a guest, and had therefore made enough food for 6 people on the principle that generosity costs nothing and scarcity costs everything, sat Helen down at the kitchen table with the same efficient warmth she had shown Clara 4 months before. She asked nothing invasive. She put coffee and biscuits on the table and sat across from the girl and let the silence be comfortable until Helen was ready to fill it. Clara sat to the side and listened. Helen's story came out in pieces, the way these stories always did, not in a clean narrative, with a beginning and middle and end, but in fragments that reassembled into something coherent. Only gradually, the way a person rebuilds their own account of events when they've been taught for too long that their account doesn't count. A husband in St. Louis. 3 years. A mother-in-law who saw everything and said nothing because family protected family, even when family was the danger. A lawyer who had looked at Helen across a desk and told her that without witnesses, without documentation, there was very little the law could do. She had left with $32 and a train ticket and a name she'd heard through the kind of whisper network that didn't have a formal structure because it couldn't afford to be formal. It was just women talking quietly to other women, passing the information that kept people alive. Clara's name. Julesburg. The story of what had happened at the stockyard. "They said you stood up in public," Helen said. "That you said the truth out loud in front of everyone. That the town listened." She looked at Clara with the specific intensity of someone examining a thing they've been told exists, but haven't fully believed until this moment. "I needed to know if that was real, or if it was the kind of story that gets better in the telling." "It's real," Clara said. "It was also terrifying, and my hands were shaking the entire time, and it didn't fix everything overnight." She held the younger woman's gaze. But it was real, and the ground held. Helen was quiet for a moment. "My husband's brother is a marshal in Kansas," she said. "If he finds out where I went—" "He won't find it from anyone in this room," Martha said, without drama, without excessive reassurance. Just as a fact. Helen looked at Martha, then back at Clara. "What do I do now?" she said. "Today," Clara said. "You eat the biscuits because Martha made enough for an army, and she'll be insulted if you don't. And then you sleep in the blue room, which has a key on the inside of the door." She paused. Everything else we figure out in order. One thing at a time. Helen pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright very briefly before she controlled it. The key's on the inside, she repeated. Always, Clara said. Having Helen at the ranch changed the texture of the days in ways Clara hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected it to be heavy, another person's crisis absorbing the fragile stability she had spent 4 months constructing. What she found instead was that it clarified things. Having someone else in the early stages of what she had already come through gave her a kind of reference point she hadn't had before, a way of seeing her own progress that was harder to perceive from the inside. Helen flinched at sudden sounds. Clara recognized the flinch. She had worn it for months. Helen apologized for everything, for taking too much space, for speaking too directly, for laughing too loudly, for existing at a volume above invisible. Clara recognized that too. She did not tell Helen to stop apologizing. She simply consistently treated Helen's presence as something welcome rather than something tolerated, and watched the apologies gradually become less frequent, the way her own had. Wyatt adapted without discussion. He gave Helen the same consideration he had given Clara from the beginning: the unhurried patience, the lack of sudden movements, the practice of announcing himself before entering a room. He answered her questions about the ranch without condescension. He did not treat her like a problem Clara had brought home or a charity case requiring management. One evening, Clara found Helen watching Wyatt from the kitchen window while he worked in the corral, and Helen's expression was not admiration exactly, but something more complicated, the expression of someone recalibrating a category. "He's not what I expected," Helen said. "No," Clara said. "He isn't." "How did you know he was—" Helen searched for the word. "Safe." Clara thought about it seriously. "I didn't," she said. "Not for certain, not right away. I watched the way he treated the horses. I noticed that he corrected things by showing me, not by making me feel stupid for not knowing. I noticed he never used what I told him as a weapon against me later." She paused. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of a lot of small things being consistent. Helen was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take to trust him fully?" Clara considered. "I'm not sure I can give you a date. I just know there was a morning I woke up and realized I hadn't listened at the door before opening it, and I thought I must trust this house now." Helen looked at her. "I want that," she said. "I want to wake up and not listen at the door." "You will," Clara said. "Not on a schedule, not in a straight line, but you will." The reading circle opened on the first Thursday of September in the back room of May Sutton's post office, which May had repainted in the particular decisive way of a woman who has been waiting for a project and has finally been handed one. 6 women came to the first meeting. Clara had prepared for the possibility that nobody would come, and had also prepared because she was a woman who believed in having contingency plans for the possibility that too many would come, and the room would not hold them. 6 was between those two outcomes, which felt approximately right. Dorothy Phelps came as promised. May, who was technically hosting, and therefore didn't count. A young wife from the north end of town named Rose, who said very little, but whose eyes moved across the lending library shelf with a hunger that Clara recognized. A widow named Agnes, who turned out to have strong opinions about literature and the willingness to express them. Martha, who had specifically said she was coming to make sure it got started properly, and would then be happy to step back, and who Clara suspected would never step back as long as she was drawing breath. And Helen. Helen sat in the corner chair with her hands around her coffee cup and listened to the first hour without speaking, which was completely fine, because listening was a form of presence, and presence was enough. It was in the second hour when Agnes and Dorothy had a spirited disagreement about the moral architecture of a novel. Clara had put on the shelf that Helen said quietly, "I think they're both right, actually. The character did what she had to do with the options she had. You can think she was wrong and also understand why she did it." The room paused, not because the observation was controversial, but because it was precise, and it reframed the argument in a way that moved it forward, rather than simply continuing it. Agnes looked at Helen. "That's exactly the distinction I was trying to make," she said. "Where did you study?" Helen blinked. I read. Mostly. That counts, Agnes said with the authority of a woman who has decided. Something in Helen's face opened. Clara watched it happen, and felt something she had no clean name for, warm and specific and located somewhere in the center of her chest. The feeling of watching a door open that had been closed for a long time. She knew that feeling from the inside. Seeing it from the outside was something else entirely. After the meeting, when the others had gone, and they were stacking chairs and putting the room back in order. Order, Helen said without looking up from the chair she was folding. I think I'd like to help run this. Good, Clara said. I was going to ask you. Helen looked up. You're organized. You think clearly under pressure, and you know exactly what kind of women might need this room and what they need when they get here. Clara set a chair against the wall. I know what it was to arrive needing it. I need someone who remembers that more recently than I do. Helen was quiet for a moment. I'm not fixed, she said. I'm still working through it. So am I, Clara said. That's not a disqualification. That might be exactly the qualification. Ciao. The twist nobody had anticipated came in October, 6 weeks after Helen's arrival, in the form of a letter from the federal court in Denver. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Wyatt across from her and Helen in the doorway, and the silence that followed the reading was the kind that has texture and weight. Gideon's deal fell through, she said. Wyatt's expression sharpened. How? He tried to negotiate additional terms after the agreement was signed. He wanted a provision that would have sealed the evidence record, meaning the documentation of the fraud methodology would have been inaccessible for any future proceedings. She looked at the letter. The prosecutor refused. Gideon withdrew from the deal. Which means, Helen said from the doorway, which means it goes to full trial. Clara set the letter down. Which means I will likely be called as a primary witness. In Denver. In front of a federal court. The kitchen was very quiet. She had been here before in some version of this, facing the scale of what Gideon was capable of, and what it would cost to face it fully. She knew the weight of it. She knew what it asked. When? Wyatt said. The lawyer estimates spring. He says the evidence is stronger for a full trial, that the deal would have benefited Gideon more than it benefited the court record. She paused. He says the sealed evidence provision was the tell. Gideon doesn't just want a reduced sentence. He wants to make sure nobody can use this case as precedent. Wyatt looked at her steadily. Because if it becomes precedent, then what he did has a name in legal record. Then other women who find themselves in similar situations have something to point to. She met his eyes. He doesn't want that to exist. But you do, Wyatt said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. I do. Helen had come fully into the kitchen by now. She sat down at the table without being invited in the way she had started doing in the past few weeks. The casual, unself-conscious occupation of space that was one of the most concrete measures of how far she had come. If you testify, Helen said carefully, and if it becomes record, it's not just about your case anymore. No, Clara said. It's about every case after it. Yes, Helen looked at the letter on the table. At Clara, at Wyatt. Then you have to do it, Helen said simply. Clara looked at the young woman who had arrived on a Wednesday with $32 and a name she'd heard through a whisper network, who now ran the Thursday Reading Circle's lending records with the precision of someone who had found a thing they were built for. I know, Clara said. She wrote to the lawyer that afternoon and confirmed her willingness to testify. Then she went out to the corral and stood with the gray horse for a while, not riding, just standing with her hand on the animal's neck, and the October air moving around them both with the first real bite of coming cold. Wyatt found her there, which she had expected. He had a talent for finding her in the right moment, which she had stopped attributing to coincidence, and had started attributing to the specific quality of attention he paid to her movements. He stood beside her at the fence. You all right? He said. I'm afraid, she said. I want to be honest about that. Denver, a federal court standing up in front of lawyers who are paid to make witnesses look unreliable. She pressed her hand more firmly against the horse's neck. I'm afraid. I know, he said. but I'm going to do it. I know that too. She looked at him. Will you come with me? He looked back at her with the expression she had come to know as his version of something enormous, said quietly. Clara, he said, I was going to ask you the same thing, and I was worried you'd say you didn't need me to. She almost laughed. I need you to. Then I'm coming, he said. That settled. She leaned her shoulder against his arm, not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, just the small certain contact of a person who has finally found the place where leaning is safe. He stayed exactly where he was. The gray horse breathed between them, patient and steady, entirely at ease. Takai. The trial was in April. The courthouse in Denver was larger than anything Julesburg had formal in the way of institutions that understand their own importance, and Clara walked into it on a Tuesday morning in a blue dress, not the torn one from the stagecoach, but a new one, the color of the Colorado sky in high summer, which she had chosen deliberately because she was done wearing things that apologized for her presence. Wyatt was in the gallery. Martha was beside him, because Martha had announced 3 months ago that she would be attending the trial, and nobody had possessed sufficient argument to change her mind. Helen was there too. She had taken the train from Julesburg with them, had sat across from Clara the entire journey, with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and had said at the Denver station, Whatever happens in there, it already matters. You already did the thing that needed doing. This is just the record of it. Clara had looked at her for a moment. When did you get wise? She said. Somewhere around the third Thursday reading circle, Helen said. Agnes is a significant influence. Clara had laughed genuinely and fully in the middle of the Denver train station, and several strangers had looked at her with the slightly startled expression of people who weren't expecting that sound in that place, and she hadn't minded at all. She testified for 2 days. Gideon's lawyer was skilled and relentless, and tried every available approach attacking her memory, her motivations, the legitimacy of her marriage, the credibility of her documentation. He used words like unstable and impressionable, and emotionally compromised, in tones that were professionally sympathetic, which she understood was meant to be more damaging than open contempt. She answered every question directly. She did not perform distress. She didn't feel. She did not minimize the things that had happened. She did not soften her account for an audience she was afraid of, which was the version of herself she had spent 8 months constructing in that locked room in Boston, the version that made herself small to make the room safer. She was not that version anymore. On the second afternoon, Gideon's lawyer asked her in a tone designed to suggest the question was simple. Mrs. Mercer, isn't it possible that your account of events has been shaped by your current circumstances? That having found a comfortable situation in Colorado, you have a certain interest in portraying your departure from Boston in the most favorable light possible. Clara looked at him. My account of events, she said, is supported by 12 pages of documentation written by my father before his death, a falsified probate filing that your client submitted to the magistrate's office, a forged entry in my husband's ledger, and the testimony of a federal judge who reviewed all of the above. She paused. If my account has been shaped by anything, it's been shaped by the fact that it's true. Comfortable circumstances don't change the truth. They just make it easier to say out loud. The courtroom was quiet. The lawyer moved to his next question. Gideon at the defendant's table did not look at her. He had not looked at her once during the entire 2 days. She had noticed that, and had decided it was information, the behavior of a man who understood that looking at her now would cost him something he couldn't calculate and couldn't afford. She had spent years afraid of his eyes. He was now afraid of hers. That was not a small thing. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon in late April. Guilty on 3 counts of fraud. Guilty on 1 count of filing a false legal instrument. Guilty on 1 count of obtaining fraudulent probate authority. The sentence was 4 years. The evidence record, all of it. Her father's letters, the documentation, the full account of the methodology Gideon had used, was entered into the federal court record and made available for reference in future proceedings. Clara sat in the gallery beside Wyatt when the verdict was read, and she felt his hand cover hers on the bench between them, and she thought about a kitchen table in Julesburg, and a coffee cup, and a letter with Gideon's handwriting, and the cold that had moved through her when she understood he was coming. She thought about who she had been when that letter arrived, still flinching, still listening at doors, still learning that the key on the inside of her own room was something she was allowed to use. She thought about her father's careful hands and his careful letters and the path he had built in the dark for her to find. She had found it. "Hey," Wyatt said quietly close to her ear. She turned. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. This man who had stepped between her and a laughing crowd and called her his future wife without hesitation, who had given her a key and a gray horse and the space to become herself without interference, who had come to Denver and sat in a gallery for 2 days watching her do the hardest thing she had ever done and had never once suggested she couldn't. "It's done," she said. They came home to Julesburg on a Saturday, and the town that had once whispered about the damaged Boston woman on the stagecoach went about its ordinary business, and the reading circle met on Thursday as it always did, and Helen ran the lending records, and Agnes had opinions, and Dorothy brought her lemon cake, which had turned out to be genuinely excellent, and had been forgiven for its original use as a social weapon. 2 more women had written to Clara since Denver. The Whisper Network had carried the trial outcome the way it carried everything quietly, reliably, from one safe hand to the next. She wrote back to both of them. "Yes. Come. The ground holds here." On a Sunday evening in May, Julesburg held its summer gathering at the edge of town, the annual occasion that served as the social reset of the community, the moment when whatever had accumulated over the winter and spring got acknowledged and set down. Clara and Wyatt arrived together, which they always did now, and the arrival was unremarkable because they had been arriving together for months, and unremarkable was exactly what Clara had learned to treasure about certain things. The man who had collared her damaged goods on the stagecoach platform, a cattle buyer named Rowan, who passed through Julesburg 3 or 4 times a year, was there. She had not seen him since that first day. He saw her across this gathering, and something in his posture changed. Not the comfortable man who had made a joke at a stranger's expense without consequence, but something less certain. The posture of someone who has had time to think about a thing and not arrived at a comfortable place about it. He crossed the space between them. Wyatt beside her went still. Not threatening, just present the particular stillness of someone who is paying attention and will respond to whatever is needed. Rowan stopped in front of Clara. He was a big man, middle-aged, the kind who had probably never been told in his life that he had gotten something wrong in a way that required correction. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was gruff and slightly strangled, the voice of a man doing something his vocal cords were not accustomed to. "I said something when you arrived in Julesburg about damaged goods." He stopped, cleared his throat. "I want to say that was wrong of me, and I'm sorry for it." Clara looked at him. She thought about that moment, the dust and the heat, and her palm flat against the street, and laughter coming down from somewhere above her. She thought about how much she had carried from that moment, the specific wound of being reduced to a transaction gone bad in her first 60 seconds in the place that was supposed to be her safety. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." He nodded once with the relief of a man who has been carrying something and has finally been allowed to set it down. He moved away into the crowd. Wyatt looked at her. "How does that feel?" he said. She considered it honestly. "Like something that needed saying got said," she said. "Not more than that. Not a resolution of anything fundamental. Just a thing that was wrong acknowledged." She paused. "That matters, even when it's small." "It matters," he agreed. Martha appeared at her elbow with a plate of food, and the expression of a woman who has been managing occasions since before Clara was born, and intends to continue doing so indefinitely. "Eat something," Martha said. "You've been righteous and principled for 2 months straight. Your body needs biscuits." Clara took the plate. "Martha," she said. "Thank you. For the letter. For all of it. For being what my father trusted you to be." Martha looked at her for a moment, really looked with the full attention she rarely directed at sentiment because sentiment made her practical exterior difficult to maintain. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "I'm proud of you. Now eat the biscuits before they go cold and stop making me say emotional things in public." Clara ate the biscuits. Later in the summer evening, with the gathering winding down around them, she stood beside Wyatt on the edge of the crowd and looked out over the town that had been a stranger's name on a correspondence card, and was now the place where she knew which storekeeper gave short measure, and which roads washed out in summer storms, and which women needed the Thursday circle most and wouldn't say so. The place where a gray horse knew her footstep and came to the fence without being called. The place where a man had once said, "No door in this house will ever lock you in," and had meant it every single day since. Wyatt's hand found hers in the space between them. She held it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "When I stepped off that stagecoach," she said, "I was not looking for a life. I was looking for a place to stop running. I was looking for a door with a lock on the inside, and enough distance between me and Boston that I could breathe." She looked out at the town, the summer dark coming down over it, the lights in the windows. "I didn't know I was also going to find this." "What's this?" he said. She turned to look at him. "Everything," she said simply. He looked back at her. This man who had never once used her wounds against her, who had given her space and ground and silence and coffee and a horse, and his steady, unhurried presence, who had sat in a Denver courtroom for 2 days, watching her be braver than she'd known she was, and had never suggested she needed his protection more than she needed her own voice. "Good," he said, "because I intend to keep it." She turned back to the town. The summer night settled around them, warm, wide, full of ordinary sounds, the sounds of a place that was alive and real and hers. Clara Mercer had arrived in Julesburg, bruised and running, and had believed in her most honest moments that survival was the best she could hope for. She had been spectacularly, gratefully, completely wrong. She had not merely survived. She had taken root, and nothing, not cruelty, not distance, not the long memory of locked rooms and learned fear, would pull her from this ground again.